Oh, hi.
And yes, we are going live. We are live right now.
We are live.
Okay.
Hello, I warmly welcome you to our 62nd webinar by the Academy of Space Renaissance International. On this 20th of May, I'm delighted that you have come to join us. And my name is Sabina Heinz, and I'm the person responsible for our webinar series. And I'm one of the vice presidents of Space Renaissance International and also responsible for our art chapter. Our today's special guest is Professor Milan Ćirković. Hello, Milan.
Hello, great to be here.
Yeah, we are really glad to have you here. And Professor Ćirković will talk today about nutshell kings, roots of resistance to human space exploration and settlement. I also would like to welcome Adriano Ottino. He is also one of our vice presidents and former president and one of the founders of Space Renaissance International. Hello, Adriano.
Hello, Sabine. Hello, Milan. Very, very happy to have you here. I'm very honored too. And a lot of people are waiting for your lecture today, and we are all eager to listen to you. So,
Yes. We
let's
have
go.
people watching from London, from Serbia, and from the Netherlands, from Germany, from many countries. So before I give you the floor, I would like to introduce you to our audience. Professor Milan Ćirković, I pronounce it well. Ćirković?
That's okay. That's okay.
Okay, is a senior research professor at the Astronomical Observatory of Belgrade in Serbia and a research associate of the Future Humanities Institute at Oxford University in Oxford in UK. He obtained his PhD at the Department of Physics, State University of New York and Stony Brook in 2000 with a thesis in astrophysical cosmology. His primary research interests are in the fields of astrobiology, habitable zones, habitability of galaxies, SETI studies, philosophy of science, future studies, philosophy of cosmology, and risk analysis, global catastrophes, observation selection effects, epistemology of risk. And he co-edited the widely cited anthology on global catastrophic risk. It was published by the Oxford University Press in 2008 with Nick Bostrom. And wrote for research, also four research monographs, the latest being Cosmic and Microwave Background, Philosophical and Historical Aspects, also published by the Cambridge University Press in 2024, together with Mr. Perovic, as well as 5 popular science general nonfiction books, and authored about 200 research and professional papers. And he is currently working on the terrors of the Earth, why we ought to leave this planet, and soon to be published in 2025 by Penguin Random House. Milan, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here, and I especially thank everybody, especially Adriano, who was so kind to invite me and with whom we have so many pleasant conversations via mailing list. Okay, now first of all, I have to mention while you were introducing me, unfortunately, and here I put it in the title on the title slide, and I'll share screen right now. Let me try to do this. Okay, and I need to start a slideshow. Okay, is everything fine at your end? You see? Slides,
Yes,
okay.
perfectly.
I have to put it X Future of Humanity Institute because unfortunately, as you may have heard from the media, due to bureaucratic pressures and obstacles, Future of Humanity Institute has closed down a couple of weeks ago, literally in April this year. Unfortunately, we hope that there will be more such future-oriented institutions in the future. But this also gives us a little bit of a taste of the topic of today, because actually this is an example when praiseworthy visionary initiative actually encounters strong resistance, actually maybe too strong for it to be sustainable yet. Maybe some of this apply to our vision, and I hope our shared vision of human space exploration and settlement, or the topic we are going to discuss today. Okay, now let me try immediately to reveal the mystery. Of course, the title is a reference to the famous quote by Prince Hamlet. I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. This is Hamlet in Act 2, Scene 2, and this is, I would say, highly instructive for our topic and for entire philosophy, how to speak, philosophy of the future and philosophy of space research and space settlement. It just gives us a kind of a little bit of taste of what I like to call the new geocentrism, which I will discuss in a minute later, and we shall see how relevant actually and how metaphorically correct this quotation actually is. Okay, what are we going to talk today? If we discuss space exploration and settlement, all possible activities which are included in space exploration and settlement as a single entity, I shall try, I don't like acronyms very much, but I'll try to use them sparingly, but let me call it SES instead of repeating ad nauseum space exploration and settlement. What do we have? What do we encounter as obstacles? We encounter, of course, natural obstacles, which are highly visible and everybody knows about them. We are living at the bottom of Earth's gravitational well. In space, we encounter hard vacuum, we encounter ionizing radiation, which is potentially harmful. We encounter the fact that resources on planets, moons, asteroids, and other small bodies are distributed highly unevenly, so it is sometimes very hard to get to them, etc. And that is obviously a consequence of nature. Now we have some other issues, some other obstacles and challenges, which are obviously consequences of human activities. And now also we have something which is quite usual, I'd say normative, something like barriers of economy. It is simply expensive. It is still expensive in spite of getting cheaper and cheaper to get into space. We have many barriers in the field of politics. Obviously, many space missions and especially ambitious space missions for the near future require a kind of international cooperation and coordination, which is always difficult. We have a kind of outdated legal frameworks about which some of previous speakers at the Space Renaissance have talked about very inspiringly. We have general, what I would call general inertia of political thinking. So after all, when steam engine was discovered, and previously when I guess when wheel was first discovered, and when our ancestors discovered ways of I don't know, lighting fire, there were always people who would say, "Oh, this is something newfangled, this is something radical. We don't want it. It is suspicious. We are unsure whether it's good for us, etc., etc." But that is all rather old, rather conventional, something which we have got accustomed to since the beginning of the space age, and even before. before the launch of Sputnik 1. There were when in the time when there was some just like visionary thinkers like Tsiolkovsky or like Goddard, who were just like mocked around, including the famous mocking of Goddard in New York Times in 1920s. Okay, that's something which we all know about, but there is something which is somewhat new recently, and that is exactly what I will intend to talk about today. That is a kind of active resistance to space activities and to space exploration and settlement, which manifests itself mostly in what could be called cultural realm, in science and philosophy, in some professional research papers in space science, in journals such as Futures or Space Policy or Acta Astronautica or other journals, in general culture, in some Hollywood blockbusters, in other movies, in some computer games even, etc., in media, taken all together, including social media. And that is about that so far, but I have intentionally put here an ellipsis because unfortunately, as in other cases of active resistance, it could actually go further and present more formidable and, in a sense, more practical obstacle to future space activities, which we shall be aware of, and we should research such potential dangers and even threats to our projects of space exploration and settlement. This is what we are going to talk about today. Now, this is not an easy topic to discuss, and I'm perfectly aware of it, that it creates a kind of awkwardness from time to time in people, because there is always a kind of fraternity of people who believe, who have a kind of visionary attitude towards, who are fans or enthusiasts, if you wish, of space exploration, and that has always been the case. And the great inspiring works of fiction like Arthur Clarke, or even before him, like Olaf Stapledon and Karl Čapek and others, often created a kind of enthusiasm which translates on an emotional level as well. And when you encounter obstacles, when you encounter people who have ideas which are directly opposite to yours, and even in a sense proclaim your ideas to be not only doubtful, but also sometimes immoral, sometimes aesthetically unpleasing, sometimes counterproductive, sometimes unjust, as we shall discuss later, then there are people who find it disconcerting, even disturbing, and there are people whose reaction is just to ignore it and to like put our hands in the sand here, and to ignore the whole phenomenon of resistance to space, or space skepticism, as we shall discuss later. I need to add a disclaimer, obviously. I mean, I'll try to present arguments of space skeptics in as objective and as impartial way as I can. But from time to time, I simply cannot, and I did not wish 100% to suppress my own thinking about that, because actually I do find their arguments to be rather vacuous, often on the boundary of being themselves immoral, very short-sighted, and from time to time even laughingly and ridiculously nonsensical. But anyway, they are out there. They enjoy some media attention. And I dare say the media attention which they enjoy is increasing in during the course of last couple of years. So actually, we should be studying this phenomenon. But this is just my personal disclaimer. Okay, why is that important? What's in the first place? I mean, why don't we talk about, I don't know, like finding metals on Mars, or like creating a fusion rocket or something like this. There are many reasons why I find this important, in contrast to previous large-scale human movements and migrations. contemporary space exploration and settlement occurs under various regulatory regimes, which are on one hand more democratic. That means they more depend on media, on ideas and the memes which propagate through the media in wider culture. And on one hand, they are much more intrusive and much more capable of imposing political decisions that was the case earlier. Even the most absolute monarchy, the most authoritarian absolute monarchies of the past could not actually regulate, for instance, private vessel, private ships and boats from going sailing and discovering some hitherto unknown island and I don't know, maybe bringing some resources from that island. And that was very difficult. They could tax it, of course, subsequently, as they did, but it was very difficult to enforce a kind of regulatory regime which is nowadays very easily enforced and which is regarded as normative. So in order to operate in such circumstances, we need to, if we wish to have a kind of public and political support for space exploration and settlement, we need to win what was since Sun Tzu at least, or maybe earlier, called battle for hearts and minds. Battle for hearts and minds of citizens of the world, because it is really a truly global endeavor. So actually, we need to analyze, in a sense, what our opponents are thinking. And there is an important lesson which is still very timely these days, and that is the lesson of peaceful utilization of nuclear power, which unfortunately lost the battle for hearts and minds back there in the 1970s, maybe 70s and 80s, and half a century later, today, we are still suffering from that poorly grounded decision in large parts of the world not to develop extensively nuclear power, the cleanest, the most reliable, the absolute best source of electrical energy to resolve humanity's energy needs. And that is exactly why we are facing nowadays so many problems in reintroducing nuclear power in many places, and of course in using nuclear power to at least to back up what is conventionally called renewable energy sources. And in the meantime, during the last half century, we have burned so much coal and so much fossil fuels, and we have emitted so huge amount of anthropogenic greenhouse gases that it is simply consequence of the generally wrong decision and the mostly ideological battle which was lost by proponents of nuclear energy, relegated it to a kind of a marginal or like minority resource instead of being number one source of electricity by now. We could have completely suppressed coal burning by this day if just in 1970s people simply thought differently than they did. And this is an important lesson which is actually applicable on so many levels to programs of human space exploration and settlement, and we should be extremely cautious and extremely worried, and we should do our best for space exploration and settlement to avoid this fate of nuclear power. Because, okay, nuclear power is back. It has been back recently. And this was, I guess, just slow down. But slow down which inflicted enormous cost on ourselves and on our environment. And this slowdown may be much longer in the case of space exploration and settlement if we cannot persuade people, if we cannot influence decision makers enough to understand that space exploration and settlement is a kind of imperative, not a luxury. Okay, when I mentioned previous large-scale human movements, what did I have in mind? Clearly, most of all, two examples to which I shall return from time to time in the course of this talk, mainly out of Africa, series of migrations which occurred from about 215,000 years before present till about 50,000 years before present, and actually covered most of the surface, most of land surface area of the globe, which is the reason why people are nowadays living in almost everything where they can on our planet. Although starting in a very, very, very small, very geographically limited area of the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, which is, I don't know, maybe a couple of parts in 1,000 of the total habitable land area of our planet. And of course, obviously, the second one was the European age of discovery from 15th to 18th century, roughly speaking, from Prince Henry, the navigator, to Captain James Cook, who actually enabled people to be connected in a kind of a global system for the first time. So these large-scale human movements form a kind of precedent. This precedent is rough. This analogy is not. It is not equivalence, it is not exact analogy, but there are many things and many lessons we could draw from previous large-scale human movements which apply to potential space settlement in our future. Okay, I'm just for the case for the sake of housekeeping. I mean, this content of this talk is roughly relies on those publications, recent publications of mine, mainly in journal Futures, which is perhaps the most prestigious journal for future studies, and there were some polemic there, and that was altogether. Whoever is interested, you can check those out and send me all their critical comments and impressions. Okay. A small note or a word on words used in this talk. I decided to completely equate the space skepticism with anti-space arguments and anti-space sentiments or anti-space attitudes or anti-space views or anti-space concerns, blah, 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 blah. So actually, I decided to call it that those are just different words for the same underlying phenomenon. Now, within this phenomenon, we should actually distinguish concerns, arguments, and motivations. Concerns are often rhetorical. This is when, this popular strategy on social media when the people say, oh, we are just asking questions. Arguments should be rational, and if rational, we should, in principle, at least weigh them and establish whether they are valid or invalid. And of course, motivations are a kind of tricky thing. They are often tacit, they are often unspoken, and they are often hidden on purpose. So, for example, just to give an example, which is intentionally extreme, intentionally ludicrous, concern which some people could express back in 1960s or maybe later, maybe even today, that Apollo program did nothing to alleviate child poverty, for instance. That would be concern. An argument would be when somebody claims that it is easy to show that for the cost of the Apollo program, the number of children starving could be cut in half. This argument is wrong, but at least it could be evaluated. The thing is that obviously there may be all kinds of motivations. For instance, one motivation some people would be which motivate some people to put forward those concerns and arguments would be that they wished for Soviet Union to be the first nation to put an astronaut on the surface of the moon. So, and there were many people who actually had that motivation, and we should be quite aware of it and speak of it quite frankly, in spite of that sometimes being quite awkward nowadays. Okay, we need a reality check, first of all. There are people, when you first broach the subject with many people, they say, oh, but anti-space, who are those quacks? Anti-space attitudes are marginal, insignificant, blah, blah. This is simply not true. And this is not true on several levels, on both the popular level and on the level of elite institutions like academia or like decision makers. As a historian of the space program, Roger Lonius, shown in several publications, he actually entitled a chapter in which he wrote, "Exploding the Myth of Popular Support for Apollo." Because that is mostly a myth. There was support for Apollo, but it was, as Lonius shows, quite uneven. It usually followed after some successful missions, successful moon landings, or successful return of the Apollo 13 astronauts after this explosion struck them in space. There was a surge of support, but in general, and where it matters most when discussing NASA's budget, in 1965, at the very zenith of the Apollo program, simply public poll showed that 34% of the US public favored decreasing NASA budget, and only 16% of the public favored increasing it. Okay, some people would say, oh, but NASA budget was overblown at the time exclusively due to Apollo project. Correct. When you see this is a famous NASA graph which you will see here, and everybody knows who is interested in these topics. You see, of course, the huge peak, which is Apollo project, and then you see this plateau here, which is a space shuttle era, and you see this declining, this shallow declining slope here, which is actually the International Space Station era or late shuttle post-internet. So we actually see that essentially from 1965 on, there was a kind of continuous decrease, which was, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but it was decrease in NASA's funding. Luckily enough, we now have other private enterprise and new space and all that. But the point is that in spite of all those glorious successes, NASA could not simply, did not have enough clout with the general public in order to drastically change their minds, and of course to exert sufficient pressure on the decision makers in order to maintain, of course, not a level of budgeting from 1965, but something which will not be almost monotonously decreasing till this day. Okay, and there were space skeptics back in 1960s as well. Let me illustrate this with two books, which are by authors who were very loudly proclaiming their allegiance to different kinds of the political spectrum. So they are like put here roughly from communitarian position on the left. Amitai Etzioni wrote his famous book Moondoggle, and on one hand, and from a kind of conventional conservative republicanism, William Leonard Crum wrote this book, Lunar Lunacy, in, I think, 1967 or something like this, and both strongly criticized the Apollo program. So it is not some kind of a political or at least party divide, which is crucial for the space skepticism. I shall return to this important point later in the talk. Okay, how widespread is space skepticism today? Okay, so we have a kind of a gallery, rogue gallery, as people would say in computer gaming and in other media places. Okay, there are many people who are who wrote actually one or two or more papers or books which express one or more anti-space arguments. I mean, I included here mostly serious people, and included some people who just peripherally touched upon the controversy about human space exploration and settlement. The people who peripherally touched, who were just very peripherally, tangentially dealing with this issue, were people like Steven Pinker, who in a basically single paragraph in his book Enlightenment Now, he basically wrote space colonization is a non-starter proposed by naives. And that was about it. I mean, he never returned to this, as to the best of my knowledge. He didn't discuss the topic anywhere else. There were also people who were irritated so much that they wrote a single paper of a couple of pages, like Steven Weinberg, the great physicist and Nobelist, who you see also, who explicitly opposed human space exploration and said he, of course, favors robotic space exploration, things like that, which are cheaper and safer. And he found that safety is, at least for him, the foremost concern. And there are, of course, this was just something which is peripheral. Most of these other authors actually have developed arguments in a sense of in several papers and in some cases in books, which we'll discuss briefly, very briefly, because obviously we cannot cover all them in detail. This is a part of an ongoing research project of mine to create a kind of a wider taxonomy and classification of various space skepticism views. Obviously, there are some funny entries as well, as you can see in this New York Times article on a physics chanteuse, a woman named Linda Williams, who is popularizer and promoter of science. She wrote in 2010 in Peace Review, a kind of a violently anti-space article, which is perhaps takes the prize for the most intemperate tone of discussion of the topic. And there are other people who actually discussed it in a much more serious and much more temperate tones. But it is widespread. Okay, these are some of the books. Some of the books which are okay, relatively. The current book, which contains several of her essays, is rather old, but there is one essay very important, which deals with her brand of philosophically and anthropologically inspired space skepticism. And there are other books, especially this book, Dark Skies by Daniel Dewdney, a professor of political science, especially some of them are very influential nowadays. And I'm just joking, these are not really light readings at all. Okay, and of course there is media. So that is a particularly poignant story here, because when we compare media coverage from the time of the Apollo program, from 1960s, to something which we have 50, 60 years later, the difference is literally between, I don't know, Earth and some other planets, or like, as they say, land and sky and something. Because at that time, there were the most serious journalists of the era, like Walter Cronkite, seen here, reported in depth with a lot of details, very favorably about the Apollo program. And moreover, this here is excerpt from a Soviet Pravda, which actually the academician Vinogradov, who is cited here, actually spoke on the first page of Pravda in high commendatory tones about the success of the Apollo 11 mission. So actually, even tightly regulated totalitarian communist media actually recognize the importance of that. Recognize the epoch-making thing which was occurring, and they were also lucky to be contemporaries and witnesses of. So what do we have today? We have all kinds of bizarre forms of anti-space sentiment, I would say, because it is perhaps too much to expect arguments from contemporary media, but sentiments in any case. We will have from reasons from various outlets, including some, and I intentionally put the Atlantic magazine here twice, because the Atlantic magazine in 1960s and 70s was one of the loudest cheerleaders. You can check their coverage of the Apollo program, and you will see that they were enthusiastic. They could be members of Space Renaissance, all those journalists who wrote for the Atlantic magazine in 1960s and 70s. Nowadays, they have all these frankly, and between ourselves, saying all this BS about Mars is a hellhole. Think twice about escaping Earth to an exoplanet, as if somebody seriously considered that, not knowing where exoplanets are located. Is spaceflight colonialism? And perhaps the most disappointingly, popular science, renowned popular science magazine like the Scientific American, actually stooped so low to, you see this title page here. This title page here is value neutral, as you it just asks question. Now, so will humans ever live in space? Okay, so it is legitimate, of course, everybody can ask such a question. But when you presumably buy the magazine, and then you open to that page, you will see the article, which is entitled, "Why We'll Never Live in Space." So actually, they have answered the question, but they didn't dare to put it on the cover page, which is exactly a kind of dishonest practice which characterizes today's allegedly enlightened media in comparison to allegedly benighted media in 1960 something, which were, I don't know, racist, sexist, patriarchal, blah blah blah. So actually, this is such kind of dishonesty characterizes much of the appearance and coverage of space in general in contemporary media. And of course, there are other people, like the shampoo industry, for instance. So why do I say this? Because this is obvious. This is part of a. This is not some academic ivory tower. This is some kind of very low cultural level. When they actually name a brand, there is no planet B, according to a kind of fundamentalist environment activist slogan, which actually implies the failure of human space settlement in the future. So this is the point which I shall return to it later, because it is very important, and it is so easy to overlook, especially if you choose to put your hand in sand, as many people who are quite honest, well-meaning, great characters and fans of space in general are doing with respect to active resistance and anti-space sentiment. Okay, we can distinguish basically two tiers or two levels or two leagues of space skepticism. Minor league or soft tier would be people who are saying it is too early to engage in serious SES. It is too risky. Robots are better. We should wait until we solve XYZ. Or even, okay, in that case, it smoothly transfers into this other category, because there are people who say, oh, we should resolve all terrestrial problems. And which is exactly never, because there will never be a complete solution of all terrestrial problems. People who are holding this view are people like presumably Steven Pinker, although, as I said, I mean, he laconic on that, but Steven Weinberg, Konrad Socik, Mark Okovich, who will be encountered subsequently, who wrote the most detailed account of risks of space colonization and settlement in Futures a couple of years ago. And those people are actually a kind of moderate, obviously. So there are things in which they are completely in the right. Robots are perhaps better, actually, in some extreme environments, maybe not on Mars, but on satellites of Saturn, or like on Triton or some Kuiper Belt objects. Obviously, yes, for the moment. So that is we can formally correct. Although one could also ask there if robots are in general better at space exploration, which is very sophisticated activity requiring a huge amount of computing and cognitive power. Is there anything they are not better at? Why robots in space and robots on Earth? Or just like in in legendary movie Blade Runner. I mean, we should just use robots off-world, as they say, as Sir Ridley Scott says there, or robots off-world, and then proclaim that their existence on Earth is illegal and shoot them on sight if you can identify them on Earth. So actually, are they better at writing, for instance, anti-space articles than humans? That is a question to ponder. However, this is not so. This soft theory is not so radical, and actually, this is not. It is not this minor league from which one could expect the highest level of resistance to and anti-space lobbying, for instance, which things which could objectively impede our prospects in space. On the other hand, in this major league, anti-space skeptics, there are people who argue that it is intrinsically, that is in itself, immoral or undignified or aesthetically unpleasing, as Robert Sparrow would put it, or dehumanizing, as Leon Kass would say, or unjust, as Phil Torres or many others would say, to go into space. And it has, some of them add, it has zero chance of success in any case. So this hard space skepticism, or this major league of anti-space sentiment, actually melds pretty smoothly into kind of a general either neo-Luddism or neo-primitivism or outright nihilism about future of humanity. Maybe many of them are nihilist about future of humanity on Earth as well as in space. So that should be kept in mind as well. And there are many representatives, some of which I have already mentioned, some of which I will discuss in a moment. Okay, now we need to look at it with slightly higher resolution. So actually, we can identify, in my view, about basically five major directions or avenues of anti-space thinking, some of which is very old. Like economic thing has been with us since the beginning, since the dawn of the space age. There are simply people who are economic conservatives, fiscal conservatives, who say it's too expensive, it's too risky. We need to wait more. We need to wait for technology to get more mature and to get cheaper. So many people, including W.L. Crum, including Steven Weinberg, including Lord Martin Rees, would be in this category. Lord Martin Rees wrote a fine booklet on the future, entitled On the Future, which covers in part, there is a chapter on space explorations in which he argues essentially a kind of safety and expenses conservative approach, and say that radical space exploration and settlement of other celestial bodies will have to wait a kind of post-human or our transhuman or artificial intelligence or some other radical change in human nature. And then we have all these other categories are much newer, especially the last two, environmental and what I dubbed identity politics, for the lack of better word. I could call it postmodernist, for instance, or social constructivist or critical constructivist, if you wish. Now, these last two are completely new. Environmental concerns were known since, I don't know, Buckminster Fuller, perhaps back in 1950s, but they were not taken seriously till about the turn of the millennium. And afterwards, now we see it became, not without justification and not without reason, one of the prime topics in the whole world of human society and culture. And of course, in this big tent of people who are environmentally engaged in one way or another, most people are completely reasonable, most people are moderates, most people are people who are actually, there is a minority which is small, but it is sometimes very vocal, very aggressive, which actually is represented well by movements such as neo-Luddism, neo-primitivism, deep ecology movement. There are people like eco-terrorists, eco-fascists, who are actually engaged in on a fringe of the great environmental movement. And some of them are very loud in a kind of space skepticism or outright hostility toward any kind of space enterprise. And there is this, for instance, the organization, extreme deep ecology organization known as Earth First, is actually a very good example of that. Their main reason is that, you know, space exploration settlements draws resources away from other Gaia and from all these worthy causes, or perhaps, in the words of their kind of a martyr in some of their circles, Theodor Kaczynski, whom I intentionally refer here by his terrorist name, Unabomber, actually openly say that this is a kind of a dying gasp of industrial society which cannot be sustained anymore, blah, blah, blah. And of course, there are people who are like smitten by identity politics, by social constructivism, and it, strangely enough, it joins with kind of Hobbesian politics, which is kind of often touted as a kind of a real politic way of thinking, which suggests that, for instance, if we allow space settlement, there will be endless intergroup wars. There will be even a kind of new kind of people. There will be, Phil Torres, for instance, worries about speciation of humankind in the future and getting several neo-humans who will be locked in endless wars and the conflicts with one another, etc. This is largely science fictional stuff, but some of it unfortunately captures some dark corner of people's imagination and enjoys a rather high degree of media visibility. And of course, there are among more serious categories we encounter, for instance, ethical categories mostly based on negative utilitarianism that is simplified, of course, we cannot go into details here. In a simplified terms, negative utilitarianism is the highest good is avoiding suffering. And proponents of this space skepticism, which are informed by ethical concerns, actually worry that settling other planets, exporting not only humans, but other animals will lead to increased suffering. They say it will lead to further repetitions and replications of our Earth experience, which they regard highly negatively. And they regard, for instance, animal welfare as a kind of a very important value, which has been suppressed during most of human history. And they are worrying that we will continue to suppress it in the future and in space colonies, etc., etc. This was in part, not entirely, but in part, motivation behind Hannah Arendt's famous anti-space essay, where she argued that large-scale space exploration, she did not really invoke kind of colonization and settlement of other bodies, but will actually rob humans of their deep dignity, or factor X, as Francis Fukuyama would later call it. And of course, there is also a very prominent strand of anti-capitalist space skepticism, which is interesting because actually it was a non-starter for most of the space scene. Only in the last 10 years or so, since important private startups emerged in the context of space industry and in the context of space exploration and settlement, did this issue appear at all. So there are many people who are actually, including late French philosopher Bruno Latour, and many people in the media, who actually argue that space exploration and settlement in this privatized era of new space, for instance, is a reflection of capitalist mentality, resource grab, commodification, blah, 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 all these tiresome cliches they often explicitly invoke and cite from the Frankfurt School and other neo-Marxist schools. So in some cases, I guess it is rather easy to say what one can do to allay fears and to, in a kind of tone down and achieve some compromise with those groups. In some cases, this is rather easy. I mean, if you are worrying about the high price of launching things into space, you should work toward cheapening decrease of the launch costs and maybe building a space elevator in the farther future and making space more accessible. If you are worrying about people behaving immorally on other planets as well as on Earth, then you should work just the same as you would do on Earth either. So you will work towards some kind of moral enhancement. There is a big topic of moral bioenhancement. Maybe it's not moral bioenhancement, maybe it's just better moral education, for instance. But in any case, it's easy to see what is to be done if we wish to reach some sort of compromise with them. With some people, especially those belong to this last category of identity politics, it is unclear to me, in spite of the best efforts, to see what in the world would placate them, or what in the world would lead them to kind of rapprochement with space exploration and settlement vision. Okay, typical skeptical statements which you can encounter in literature are those like human space exploration is too risky, it should be left to robots. Human space settlement will exacerbate the existing inequalities. This is an important argument, which was brought by Konrad Socik, who is not really a kind of space skeptic. I mean, he is somewhere in between. He is both a fan and a skeptic in the same time, as he explained to me. Someday he's a good friend and a great guy all together, although we disagree, obviously, on some points. But there are people who argue that, for instance, life on Mars will be, in space colonies, will be unhappy, brutal, and short, which is a kind of Hobbesian paraphrase, and which is perhaps true as well. But the real question is whether it is a reason to ban colonization of Mars or establishment of space colonies, because at the time of Thomas Hobbes and the later time, even those societies which are most prosperous today on Earth, life there was really unhappy, brutal, and short. Imagine how first people who arrived on New Zealand, for instance, to take one especially successful nation of today's world, their lives in like 18th and 19th century were just like Hobbes described them earlier. So actually, this is not really, was that a reason if somebody was to tell our ancestors in Olduvai Gorge at the Great Rift Valley in Africa that, you know, if you spread around, many of you will live unhappy, brutal, and short lives, was that reason enough for them to stay in Africa, around their place of origin? That is a real question to reflect upon. Okay, a spectacular example, a really spectacular example is Torres's assertion that humans should not colonize Mars, since ultimately Mars will succeed and establish its political independence, and secession of Mars could cause catastrophic interplanetary war. Now, this is, of course, this could happen, and one would say that would be interesting, a reversal of a kind of War of the Worlds of Herbert George Wells or something like that. But unfortunately, I mean, as an argument, it is, as a general argument, it is, in my opinion, fairly limited to say, to be polite as much as possible, because it is completely tantamount, in my view, to arguing that we should evacuate one of Earth's hemisphere. We shouldn't really settle human beings on both hemispheres, because, you know, one day hemispheres could engage in a catastrophic war leading to extinction of humanity and something like that. Okay, there are further philosophical reasons. Some people elaborated reasons for space skepticism, which were analyzed by people who are not themselves space skeptics, like British or Scottish philosopher Tony Milligan, who actually wrote a very nice paper in 2022 on ground bias. He argues that there are people by virtue of living on the surface of our planet, people are simply biased toward things which are similar to the surface of our planet. And they don't like us going deep down, and they don't like us going high up. And this is a very interesting paper, interesting argument. Probably ground bias has something to do with, at least in some cases, or at least with the reception of some of the anti-space arguments. A very important factor, which should not be downplayed in any way, is safetyism. Safetyism, as discussed on other non-space examples by Lukianov and Haidt in their best-selling wonderful book, The Coddling of the American Mind, has become a kind of powerful global ideology. This was seen excellently during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is something which we encounter almost every day. There is a media fuels this perception of anything which leads to risk or danger as catastrophic. Media is capable of amplifying the message of, I don't know, some earthquake or some fire, like killing some people, to the level of a really frightening thing, which simply goes into our homes and goes into our minds and tends to frighten us and tends to make us think that we should engage in safety at all costs. All those kinds of precautionary principles, precautionary thinking, much of it is manifestation of safetyism. And since obviously space exploration and settlement would never be made completely safe, this is obvious nonsense. But, travel on Earth cannot be made completely safe and never will be, presumably. So in spite of the fact that, for instance, air travel has wonderful safety record, as unbelievably safe way of traveling, but you cannot really make it completely 100% safe. But the media exerts pressure on us to try to ask for 100% safety, which is, of course, nonsense. And then there is a tension which leads to deep frustration and which carries with itself a real risk of arresting space efforts, just as the catastrophe of Challenger, which, as Richard Feynman proved in 1986, 1987, could have been avoided so easily. But it arrested and slowed down space development for at least a decade, people estimate. And there is something else which I'm working on it currently, and manuscripts currently in preparation. There is a kind of new geocentrism, which is a kind of a semi-mystical, quasi-religious environmental thinking, which actually is not linked at all to real ecology. The late, recently deceased great James Lovelock, the father of the Gaia hypothesis, was very pro-scientific, pro-technology. In his 100th year of his life, he published a book which was actually pro-transhumanist and pro-space exploration and pro-visionary technological optimism. So actually, and he would have nothing to do with those people, but there are people who took Gaia hypothesis to a kind of mysticism and quasi-religion, and actually formed around it a kind of new geocentric way of thinking, which is somewhat similar to the old geocentrism, which caused such a big resistance to the Copernican revolution and caused all these, like, Galileo trial in front of the Roman Inquisition and everything else, which actually impeded the progress of science by much. So there are topics to study here under the rubric of philosophical reasons which motivate and fuel space skepticism. There are some curious psychological cases. Well, I simply could not refrain from mentioning Gary Westphal. Gary Westphal is one of the premier science fiction scholars in the world, perhaps the best. He wrote or edited absolutely magisterial works on theory and criticism of science fiction, and exactly on topics like space and beyond, the frontier theme in science fiction, for instance, and the hardware and settings of science fiction, blah, all this. And then he, in late 70s, in late 1990s, somewhat earlier, but he got a kind of anti-Enlightenment in this respect, so to speak. And in science fiction studies, of all places, he wrote a tract, The Case Against Space, which is not maybe so hysterical as Linda Williams' piece, but it is still a rather rough and rather extreme anti-space polemic, which is strange coming from a guy who actually was, like, making his money by analyzing thinking of many other people about space. And he still is a great authority when you turn especially to hard science fiction. But there is some kind of psychological effect there in a kind of a reversal, such a dramatic U-turn, which he made. And this piece of his actually is quite influential. There are several people in science fiction circles, and including some science fiction authors, like Charlie Stross, for instance, and some other, who are actually heeding his line of thought and continuing his line of thought to this in the 21st century and to this epoch. But there is some sort of psychological theme for research here as well. And of course, there is an idea that, there's no space settlement without capitalism, or vice versa. I don't know exactly. So we got papers like this: In Search for Planet B, Irrational Rationality, Capital Surrealism, and Space Colonization, which proclaims immediately in highlights, because Elsevier requires you to put these short highlights up to, I don't know, 50, 60 characters. And it says quite openly here that space colonization justifications employ the same logic that oversaw Earth's ruin. So actually, if you believe that Earth is really in ruins, so that means that you already have a kind of a quite pessimistic and nihilist mindset, then you will find this idea of creating replicas of Earth elsewhere reasonably repulsive. And of course, this paper, for instance, this is a good example of paper which is peppered by quotations from Marxist sources and just rehashing a lot of old Marxist rhetoric. Of course, in high day of Marxism, people, theoretical high day, people didn't really think about space exploration and settlement. And of course, during the Cold War, which is the biggest irony of all, during the Cold War, those guys were completely silent. Why? Because the perceived communist ideal state or communist paradise in the Soviet Union actually did first and the greatest steps in sending first satellite and the first astronaut or cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, and first spacewalk, blah, blah, blah. And simply space was very high on the priority list of all Soviet administrations. So these people who were ideologically opposed, who were pro-socialist and ideologically opposed to capitalism, actually were quite silent, very, 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 very silent during the Cold War years. And now, of course, if you consider for instance, this Chinese space propaganda poster. Look at this. This is wonderful because it really shows children astronauts on planet B, obviously, because obviously where they are standing there, planet B, they have even their pets. And what in the world did they actually find there? They find precious stones, precious gems, and as Deng Xiaoping would say, it's glorious to get rich. So obviously, if you strive for extraterrestrial richness, but with different banner and different ideological symbols, I guess that would be okay. That would satisfy space skeptics of the anti-capitalist sort. And of course, there is still a darker strand of space skepticism, which actually is anti-modernism, which is radical anti-modernism, which is very liberal, which bounds on totalitarianism. In many space skeptical writings, nobody will say that quite explicitly, but you can say, you can find individual claims, you can find statements, you can find things which are which sound quite totalitarian, especially when people are claiming, for instance, like Phil Torres did, that future citizens should not be given morphological freedom. That means they should not be given freedom to improve upon their own genome without, I guess, Big Brother deciding whether they should do this or not. And especially it is important to suppress such freedoms in distant space colonies, because in distant space colonies it would be quite difficult to send some stormtroopers, I guess, to bring those guys in order and girls. So actually there is a strand of counter-Enlightenment, and which actually shows that there is much to be said for the horseshoe theory. Ironically, Hannah Arendt was one of proponents of the horseshoe theory, in which extremes of totalitarianism on both right and left actually gradually morphs into one another. And much of it was inspired, I think, by mindsets such as directly inspired by fascism, say in Evola's famous or infamous book, The Revolt Against the Modern World, where actually you have a kind of mentality. Exactly, you can read it in some places. In Dewdney's book, for instance, in several places, that we should leave, as Evola says, let us leave modern men to their truths, and let us only be concerned about one thing: to keep standing amid a world of ruins. This is a very powerful prose, but it is very extremely morally repugnant, and I think this is a reason why we should be concerned about anti-space sentiment, especially these extremes of anti-space settlement. Sentiment, sorry. So, at the very end, what is to be done, or near the end? I have several recommendations. I mean, the first is obviously education, and the second is education, and the third one is education, because actually this is something which is absolutely the most important, especially when it concerns younger generations, who actually are going to benefit most from real space exploration and settlement. And of course, after that, I don't think there are several strategies. This is something which should be debated in forums like the Space Renaissance and others. There are many people who simply ignore space skepticism, go about their own business. Okay, this can work for them. This can work locally. Unfortunately, we are still, again, I will remind you about the winter of nuclear power, which lasted from basically 1970s until this day, or until a couple of, or last year, perhaps, when people, a couple of months ago, some people gathered in Brussels to affirm that actually, lo and behold, surprise, surprise, nuclear energy is most climate-friendly form of energy in the world that is, and the most reliable as well, and the most compact and the most adaptable to things like global trade and powering merchant shipping and powering spacecraft with nuclear power, etc., etc. But that delay of half a century could have been avoided entirely. So actually, I think that we should engage with them. We should engage with space skeptics. We should debate them. We should criticize them. We should write and speak against them in the context of a wider culture. So there are a lot of things to be done, but we should be inspired by a positive vision of the cosmic future as something which is a legacy to our children and to our descendants further down the line. So 2 thoughts, very brief, for the end of this talk. Okay, we can watch again the great movie Odyssey in Space. 2001, or we can just think about our ancient ancestors in the Old Olduvai Gorge, in a small gorge in East Africa, about, say, 300,000 years ago. And imagine for a moment an Earth skeptic or planet skeptic amongst them who approaches their leaders or shamans or whoever chiefs and warns them against leaving the Great Rift Valley, against traveling and migrating to other places, because there are all kinds of risks, all kinds of dangers awaiting them, all kinds of bad fates, all kinds of suffering actually awaiting them all around the globe. So where would we have been now if they heeded such skeptical warnings? And on the other hand, this is also an excellent paper, Space Madness, the Dreaded Disease That Never Was, published in Endeavor about a decade ago, which actually recounts this funny episode from the early history of spaceflight. There were some psychologists in NASA who were actually very worried that there will be some sort of aberrant psycho behaviors among astronauts, and then they discovered that, so a little disappointed, as the author, who is historian of science, says, a little disappointed when tests showed that astronauts are sane people, poised, professional, capable of withstanding stresses, people to look up to in any possible way. So actually, this Space Madness was complete hoax. I mean, it was never it was never a real thing. But anti-space madness, who knows? I mean, maybe it is a real thing now, and it might become a real thing in the future, and a thing to be countered, to be feared of, and to be countered by our free speech, among other things. Okay, and that would be me for the moment. Thank you for your attention. Again, great thanks to Adriano, and I'm very happy to address any questions if some arise.
Yeah, thank you so much for your interesting lecture. It was really a wide range. May I ask you to stop sharing the screen?
Okay, sure. I apologize. Okay.
Yeah,
Here.
no, but it was really, really interesting, and there was a lively discussion on the chat. I don't know if you can see it. There's one question from Dennis Alfonso Riviero. He is writing, back in 1984, there was a bombing of the headquarters of ESA in Paris. Are there any other recorded similar events in other countries? On the TV show For All Mankind, there's a bombing of GSC in Houston.
Yes, exactly. Okay, that is one of the points I couldn't, simply for constraints of time, I couldn't get to. But you only remember that ellipsis. That's a little ellipsis I left there when I described where we encounter active resistance to space exploration and settlement. I left this ellipsis because, fortunately, thus far, there weren't really a kind of violent opposition. There isn't anything remotely related, analogous, if you wish, to eco-terrorism, which is, eco-terrorism has been a thing for decades now, for maybe like 30 years. And there were many, both fatalities and many injured people, like log spiking, like all these bombs sent by mail, etc. So actually, eco-terrorism hasn't yet expanded enough to sort of transform into some kind of anti-space terrorism, and I hope it won't really do. There was this incident which was mentioned, and probably there will be some isolated incident, because after all, as in any other widely important human activity, think anything whatsoever, I mean, be it academia or organized religion or politics or health services, there will always be some people who are disgruntled enough or radicalized enough to try to do something bomb abortion clinics or bomb airports or attempt some other acts of terrorist violence. And so it is to be expected that if space, especially if space industry and space traffic becomes widespread, people nowadays are, except for period immediately after 9/11, people actually are rather faintly aware of the scope of anti-aircraft, of say air travel terrorism, which was very popular back in 1970s and 1980s. So there were all kinds of militant groups, including political, military, religious groups who actually felt radicalized enough to try, or at least to threaten, to blow away planes from the sky. If space travel becomes as generally accepted and as ubiquitous as air travel, I'm quite certain that there will be a kind of attempting hijacks of space vehicles or attempting bombings or something like this. It is, of course, important to work as was the case with real terrorist experts with whom several of whom I have spoken a lot, actually said that, of course, the best way, I mean, you can do all kinds of preventive measures. You can try to make things more secure, to make machines and, I don't know, pilots' doors and things like that more secure. But the real way of countering the terrorist threats is by working at the source, working to de-radicalize people, working after all, to remove some root causes of why some people are small minority of people, but still important minority of people are radicalized. So actually, I hope that anti-space settlement will not mature into kind of a full-blown eco-terrorist activity. I think that threat is rather remote at this time. But who knows? I mean, we should wait and see, but not just wait and see. We should also work toward explaining our goals for peaceful and global and international and as just as possible exploration and settlement in space. Exactly the reason that was exactly the topic of my polemic with Konrad Soček in Futures, because actually I tried to deflate a little bit his argument from this social inclusion, and he said, okay, we cannot allow a situation in which access to space becomes some sort of extremely privileged activity. But actually, if we reason from previous human migrations, that was never a real danger, because when we speak about migrations, for instance, of people to the New World or to Australia or to some different distant islands, those people who actually migrated were either most downtrodden, poorest segments of society who had little to lose, or there were real convicts and criminals, or maybe some political or religious convicts and criminals, and people who are actually belong to lower strata of society. And they actually, it is the great achievement of that is that essentially that was a great miracle exactly in promoting human equality after all, because people who actually were regarded as in Europe were regarded as a sort of a second or third or fourth class citizens actually created such successful societies which are as successful or even more successful than Europeans.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to give you or forward you some comments. One is from Ajay Kotari. Fantastic talk, Dr. Milan Ćirković. And another remark is from Durko Pukovic. I know, I guess you know all these people.
Okay.
Bravo. And Willy Lammeyer is asking. Another remark was from Alexik Jovan. Thank you, Milan, as always, and creative, original, and interesting talk. And from Anna Duran, excellent overview and provocative points. And here's another question from Willy Lammeyer. Sorry. According to Jared O'Neill, resistance to rigidity is a sign that breaking is going to happen quickly. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that it is happening now. Don't you think so?
Listen, I would really hope that is correct. I mean, I am very much in favor of that. By the way, Professor O'Neill was and is one of my personal idols and icons, if you wish. I mean, he was a great visionary. I mean, he was actually a great visionary in more than one sense. I mean, he's just usually famous because he just the people automatically associate him with the space colonies. But it is not just the concept. I mean, it is much deeper humanist thinking which went into that and which was behind, and which you read, if you read carefully his book, especially this famous High Frontier book, you will see that actually his foremost concern was with exactly with development of human virtues, of human dignity, of exactly human freedom to enjoy a longer and higher quality life in space due to utilization of space resources. Yes, actually, it was a great, I mean, people are now opponents, these guys who are like anti-space tend to paint O'Neill as a kind of a technocrat, some sort of cold-hearted, soulless technocrat people who wish to, like expand, I don't know, colonialism, imperialism, or whatever into space. Actually, the reality is quite the contrary. He was actually a very kind and humane and humanist-oriented person who actually regarded the failure he deeply regretted the failure of humans to fulfill all creative promises on Earth. But he said, okay, I mean, we should strive to do that as well. But if we have a much bigger resource base and we have much bigger space and a much bigger scope for our experiences and for our activities, then we can do so much more.
That's true.
Sabine?
One last question from the chat, and I give it to Adriano, also from Denise Alfonso Rivero. Oriana Falaci's account of the mid-1960s space program, If the Sun Dies, published in 1967, would you consider her ambivalent?
Probably so. Probably so. I mean, she was a very colorful person. I mean, I remember her interviews with all these old people who were very famous. At least some of them were televised later, often here in Belgrade. So actually, obvious, she was very independent thinker, and she was quite, probably she was ambivalent. Of course, I mean, at that time, I understand one reason for her ambivalence, because she had a kind of a libertarian streak in her personality. And at that time, there was no private enterprise in space. And so there was actually she could have thought that as some other people of the libertarian bent often, unfortunately, still think, but gradually they are moving and improving upon that, because actually, while access to space was completely governmental and even military monopoly, as it was during most of the Cold War era, Actually, that was pretty depressing thought to many people, because after all, I mean, if you one of the points of building a new frontier, for instance, or like settling, I don't know, like a new continent of America or wherever else, was exactly to kind of create more freedom from the conventional old-fashioned authorities. And now the thing is that during the Cold War, it was all essentially, even those astronauts and cosmonauts who were not military themselves were actually part of military trainings and actually part of military secrecy, and there were all kinds of cloak and dagger stuff which was kept deeply in the dark and which was state secrets of national security, blah blah blah. So on both sides of the Cold War, of course. Actually, this was the thing which demotivated some people, and possibly Miss Falaci, who was a kind of, I say, free spirit, actually she was ambivalent for that reason. But I'm sure that if she had lived to see this expansion of private industry and private startups into space, she probably would have changed her mind.
One question from Anna Duran, sorry, Adriano. Moving to the new world involves the decimation of indigenous populations. Will these attitudes migrate to new planets?
Listen, okay, of course, if they are inhabited, possibly, especially if they are inhabited by beings which have moral status. The thing is that we don't really think that bacteria and other microorganisms have moral status. There is this big debate in bioethics circle about whether plants have moral status. There is this famous article, do trees have standing, which is actually refers to this dilemma. So I wouldn't regard even that as settled. Of course, if there are some higher animals or complex organisms, and especially if they are obviously cognitively developed, evolved beings, anything similar to even remotely similar to what we would consider a conscious creature with obvious capacities for thinking and for like separating good from evil, etc. So we, in that case, we obviously would do good to refrain from acts of settling or occupying or whatever that is. But this is something which is very remote at this moment. I mean, we are quite sure that such beings do not exist in the solar system. Now, whether we should worry about Martian bacteria, I completely agree with Robert Zubrin that this is a non-question. I mean, this is nonsense. I mean, you don't worry about, I don't know, like 10 million bacteria which you killed when you washed your hands this morning. I mean, so why in the world one should worry about Martian bacteria, especially if, like all bacteria, they are actually resistant enough and they won't go extinct as a consequence of any human activity. And of course, human ecological awareness has just improved over the last years and decades. I mean, we are not really in the world of, Francisco Pizarro and Hernan Cortes and other conquistadors and other guys. So actually, we are nowadays doing our best, investing huge resources into preventing extinction of various species on Earth. And of course, we will, and any supporter. I think I am very certain in speaking for most of the supporters of human space exploration and settlement is that actually one of the first things to be done if we ever discover life elsewhere beyond Earth is exactly to value it highly and to praise it and to preserve it at all costs. I mean, that is a point of search for life elsewhere, which is a part of the whole scientific astrobiological enterprise, which is actually in part the reason why very serious people like Zubrin and others favor us to go to Mars in person.
maybe we need a better definition of what life really is, if you refer to bacteria and so on.
Exactly.
A last remark from John Bonsor, and then I give you the word, Adriano. He worked closely with university students, rocketry, and space development groups. And they like myself, also John Bonsor, ever since the 1970s, and do not see environmental and SES as mutually antagonistic, quite the opposite.
I completely agree. I mean, that is, I think that is the most dangerous misperception, which I tried which I try to highlight here in this talk, and I think it is a very dangerous thing to state and to promote the idea that somehow our space exploration efforts are somehow diminishing our ecological and environmental concerns. That is absolutely not the case. Quite the contrary, as for instance, Charles Fockel argued in this nice little booklet, which I will now promote here. This is Space on Earth by Charles Fockel, who is a great astrobiologist, contemporary great mind. He actually argues exactly that in order to, which is completely reasonable and intuitively plausible, that in order to achieve further progress in many areas of industry, we should simply relocate those industries into either low Earth orbit or on the surface of the moon or anywhere else rather than leave them on Earth for many reasons, including environmental and safety reasons.
Thank you. Adriano?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sabine. Of course, what can I say? Any appreciation word would be too less for this fantastic, enormous lecture. I think, no, we have to work on it. We have to work on it because there are several stimulating concepts that we have to discuss and go ahead.
Sure.
Of course, I had a lot of things, comments, and things to say, but I will only focus on three because I don't want to start a new conference now. So I think
that would be nice.
yes. Yeah, when you talk about geocentrism, a new geocentrism that is arising from the environmentalist concern, and is, I think it is very much connected to what we in Space Renaissance, in our last position paper about the key issues before 2030, we made a chapter in this paper on new colonialism, space colonialism. I believe they are not the same thing, but are connected. Geocentrism and colonialism, space colonialism are really interconnected and rises from the same root. But what I want to say is that this thread, of course, it is outside the space community because it is very well-rooted. The geocentrism is very well-rooted everywhere. But it is also inside the space community. I think, yeah, when in that slide, when you named the soft opposers and the hard opposers, there is a third category that is the opposition to expansion inside the space community. There are tendencies, but very large, that think about using space only for Earth. And,
oh yes, sure.
And go outside and take the space resources and bring them on Earth.
Oh, sure.
So this is very, very wrong for many reasons. First of all, the space resources belong to the future space communities. We don't have any right we terrestrials, we don't have any right to bring them everything on Earth. First thing. Second thing, if we bring, and maybe the first thing also from the environmentalist point of view, if we bring more resources, space resources on Earth, we will increase the pressure inside the atmosphere, inside on the Earth's surface. We cannot restart developing industrial development on Earth's surface. We have to start developing outside. Otherwise, we will only worsen the environmental and resources problem that we already have. So there are several reasons why space colonialism is a very, very bad idea. And so it is very difficult now to move ahead. Even we started to work at COPUOS in the UN environment. And when you think you have some allies over there, you realize that some of them are downstreamers. They only think about satellite technologies, no, to help people on Earth. That is true, of course. It's a very good thing that space do for all peoples of Earth. Yeah, but we cannot think that the non-spacefaring countries, the emerging countries, will be space agriculture for their whole future. They need and they want social growth too.
Sure.
And nothing better than space. Nothing better than space can bring social growth to everybody, to all peoples of Earth, in a kind of I call it a permanent space revolution, because the last entry will benefit of the experience of the forerunners. Therefore, they don't need to go through the 60 years of a long road that was made by space exploration during all this time. And so also when you talk about
maybe he wants to do some remarks.
No, but I just want to close.
Oh, are you giving another lecture now?
Yes, no. No, I believe that, no, it was also interesting that the quadrant, where authoritarian, libertarians, left, and
yeah.
Well, I believe that the true dichotomy nowadays is between development and the growth, because the geocentrism think, well, maybe don't think consciously, but however it cites very well that the growth is terrorist. In your list of the opposers, you didn't mention Serge Latouche, because of course he never talked about space. But however, in all what he wrote, it is clearly an anti-expansion. It is for the growth. And that is the growth. 8 billion people, if they remain closed inside Earth limits, has no other possibility than to the growth. But the growth will mean implosion of the civilization. Therefore, it's a no way. And so, last thing that I would like to say, most of the opposers, outside the space community, most of the opposers don't know, they ignore Gerard O'Neill. Or they simulate to ignore, they deliberately ignore him because they prefer to talk about colonizing other planets. That is very naive view. We're not talking about the students of Gerard O'Neill in the 60s already replied to him, to his question, is the surface of a planet the best place where to go, to live? And the students talked about and then replied, no. Definitely no,
Sure.
because in rotating habitats, we can reproduce the Earth environment, including gravity. That's very important. And of course, now the other problem is defend the life from the cosmic radiation. But somebody says that we can make artificial electromagnetic fields in order to make a shield. And okay, so I think O'Neill is our intellectual weapon, the best one, to oppose the opposers, let me say. And you are right. This is a work that we have to do because, okay, we have to discuss and polemize to outside of the space community, but also to talk to in the intern of the space community. In Italian, there is a popular saying that say parlare a nuora perché suocera intenda. I don't know, maybe it's not easy to understand.
No.
To talk to the la nuora is your daughter-in-law.
Uh-huh.
Okay, la nuora, daughter-in-law, and suocera is your mother-in-law. So to talk to your daughter-in-law in order that your mother-in-law will understand. Parlare a nuora perché suocera intenda.
Okay.
Yes, very nice. So yes, we have to discuss with this. And my last thing that I want to put that, yeah, sometime I put some stone in the water.
Mm.
I think, yes, I will also propose it to our Space Philosophy Committee in Space Renaissance. We definitely need to make a conference on space philosophy. It will be, well, somebody will not agree maybe because they will say that we cannot spend our time talking about the maximum system, you know? But I think we have to talk about the maximum.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So, yes, this is a proposal. If you agree that I will bring inside our committee and to Marie-Louise Heuser, Professor Marie-Louise Heuser, that's the head of the Space Philosophy Committee. And I believe that we can prepare something like that, of course, not this year, maybe in 2025. And because this kind of thing must be prepared and very, very well. So what can I say? Thank you very much, Milan, for your wonderful, really, how can I say, cross-fertilizing lecture. Excellent.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I completely agree with your points. Okay, obviously I agree with last one, which is a practical term. Of course, it will be my pleasure to help in any way possible about such activities. Absolutely, anytime. And the second, about the points you raised, I mean, I completely agree with the first. With the second, that is very interesting. This that idea that requires some, I would say, some fine tuning. Requires to kind of keep in mind both. Short and medium and long-term goals of our activities, because in short-term goals, as you have mentioned, there is no way. I mean, we can actually impose some longer-term goals on decision makers, on people who tend to see just short-term goals. We need to work slowly but certainly. We need to educate them. We need to lobby them in favor and to keep awareness about the medium and long-term goals. For the moment, I think that essentially, for pragmatic reason, maybe I slightly disagree with you on that one, because I think that for practical reasons, after all this slow burning and all this time we actually lost and basically in space exploration, that we actually should, in a sense, how to say, we should actually try to make as broad alliance as possible. So to include people who have a simple commercial economic interest in that, with the idea that in the medium and especially in the long term, we actually establish. I'm all for what you say, that essentially our descendants should be indigenous to those celestial bodies, or including artificial colonies, including adapted asteroids and adapted cometary nuclei and other places, and that actually they should enjoy all rights which will be expanded by that time to be much wider than human rights are today. So actually, I think that, and this includes, of course, I mean, both economic and other rights, and of course, freedoms from those constraints which are obvious to all of us on Earth, including the constraints following from the number of humans, from either overpopulation or, as some people predict, population crash or something like this. So actually, we should actually work toward those long-term goals for certain. And I completely agree with you on Gerard O'Neill. You are like, how do they say in America, preaching to the choir as far as O'Neill and his vision are concerned.
Yes, thank you so much.
Sorry, stimulated two more things to say. I'm sorry.
Adriano.
The first one is that the first one is the Artemis and the cislunar economy. So this is really a concrete thing that is coming, and maybe will start before 2030. And this will be very important because we think that some meaningful signs should be given to the people to reopen the hope in the.
Oh yes.
And I think Artemis. And but Artemis is controversial because what they are exactly thinking is to go to the moon and take resources and take place and to put their flag on military flags on that and so on. So it's, but however, okay, it is something that is moving. Civilization is not steady, is moving with all the good and the bad things probably. But in our view that we want humanity to expand. However, the very important thing is to expand. We cannot stay there and to discuss, no, you should not do that, you should not do.
Oh yes.
Important is to go. First thing. Second thing, I noted that you always talk about SES, space exploration and settlement. And we started to reverse the two things, because now I think exploration, it took place for the last 60 years and didn't change the things. I mean, space tourism, that's the really branch that will bring civilians in space, not astronauts, but civilians, had to rise up by itself. It was not helped by the space agencies, by the governments. They did. Space agencies didn't invest one only dollar in space tourism technologies. So now, I think further exploration is necessary, always. Exploration is always necessary, even because we are curious and we want to know what is there over the hill, you know. But now the real political focus should be on civilian space development. I wouldn't say yet, settlement, because this is part of a settlement program. However, I think we have to push our proposals on starting to put settlement in space. That means allow the people to live and work in space for a long time, not only the 6 or maximum 1 year of the space station. This is really a change of paradigm. And people doesn't have it very clear in mind, because people continue to think in terms of exploration. that's why they don't take in a proper account defense from cosmic radiations and simulated gravity. We are not experimenting simulated gravity yet. This is very bad. This is really backwarded behavior, and this is a fruit of the space exploration paradigm that is still dominating. No, space exploration is not even the downstreamers and the opposers of space expansions are not opposed to exploration. No. Because exploration, provided that there will be money for that, and I don't think so, if we don't start expanding, there will be no more money neither for space exploration. But in a theoretical, hypothetical world, space exploration could continue for other 100 years, and nothing to be constructed in a Lagrange point, let's say. So
okay, I think you're right. I mean,
no, it's not a criticism.
I hope that we can forge a different path, but you're right.
Yeah. I think when we have the conference about space philosophy, we can talk about all these topics. For the moment, I would like to thank you, Professor Milan Ćirković, because it was really, really an interesting lecture and wide-ranged, and I have so many positive remarks here in the chat. And Adriano, I would like to ask you, because there are many people interested in this conference, so maybe they can contact you, and
yes,
when we have next year the conference, maybe they want to participate. And I would be glad if I would see you again, Milan, for this conference, but maybe also as a lecturer in this webinar series.
Definitely, yes.
Definitely, yes. And
I have added my email.
Yes, I saw it. You put it in the chat. And I also would like to mention that we are an organization based on voluntary work. And our next webinar will take place on the 3rd of June. Thais Russomano will talk about the effects of microgravity on human health. And yeah, if you want to join us, if you want to join SRI, you're invited to join us. And yeah, I wish you all a nice evening. And thank you again for giving us this interesting lecture.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure, and I'll certainly see you around in both conferences, and I accept the invitation in advance.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wish you all a nice evening, also to the audience. And Adriano?
No, Milan, you will be very welcome to join our committee, Space Philosophy Committee.
Sure.
I invite you and add you to the Google group if you agree, and I think it...
Perfect. Okay, I wish you all a nice evening. Bye.
Bye.
Ad astra.
Bye. Ad astra.